Today's imagination is still captivated by the Vikings, sailors and immigrants who came from Scandinavia more than 1,200 to 1,300 years ago. Their legacy goes beyond the battlefield, and they're well known for their fearless expeditions and fearsome reputation. However, how did these famous historical people live their daily lives? A complex society with a strong foundation in customs, social institutions, and a respect for personal cleanliness and grooming, practices that may surprise contemporary audiences, lies behind the stories of raiding and conquering. Come along with us as we go back in time to discover the lesser-known facets of Viking life, illuminating the humanity, customs, and culture of these fabled Norse explorers. Bathing every Saturday. Examining the everyday practices of the Viking era provides insight into a culture where creativity and pragmatism coexisted, and survival necessitated resourcefulness. One such practice was their washing routines. We often assume that people in the Middle Ages were filthy and unhygienic. That may be the case for some, but not the Vikings. Bathing was significant to these fierce business people and fearsome warriors to the extent that it was a Saturday ritual. Several historical records and archaeological discoveries demonstrate that the Vikings also practiced several everyday hygiene practices. In this list, we'll further detail what things meant. They cared about their hair. The Vikings dispelled the myth of rugged, disheveled warriors with their elaborate hairstyles and sophisticated hygiene practices. Vikings had a lot of hair and were quite proud of it. Their preferred look was a reverse mullet, or a mullet with a longer front and a shorter rear. Vikings combed and brushed their hair daily to maintain a sleek appearance. According to historians, the majority of people who lived in what is now Europe, including the Anglo-Saxons, did not care as much about looks as the Vikings. Changing clothes frequently. Whether connected to storytelling, grooming customs, or community meetings, their traditions provide a vivid picture of a people as varied and dynamic as the environments in which they live. Viking clothing was made of wool and linen, and like modern Scandinavians, both men and women were interested in fashion. That doesn't imply that individuals had as many clothing alternatives as they do now. However, Vikings regularly changed their garments and washed them in rivers and streams. Additionally, they provided extra nice clothing for weddings and other special events. Cynically, some claim that the Vikings were conceited. They were concerned about their appearance, which may be overstating things. Nicely trimmed facial hair. Their lifestyles demonstrated a more advanced civilization than is often shown, centered on a fusion of spiritual beliefs, household duties, and a strong connection with nature. Vikings are often shown with enormous, unkempt beards in artwork, motion pictures, and television series. Historians, however, contend that this portrayal is inaccurate. On the other hand, most Vikings maintained neat and clipped facial hair. They ensured they always looked presentable by using combs, razors, and tweezers. Yep, these tools existed during the Norse Age. A contributing factor was the association of facial hair with masculinity. More on that in a moment. Saunas were super popular. Given how chilly Scandinavia is for a large portion of the year, it should be no surprise that saunas were popular in the Middle Ages. As much a part of their social life as their hygienic practices, Vikings enjoyed going to their local sauna. It served as a spot to unwind, get up to speed on the newest rumors and news, and perhaps make new friends. Saunas, just like today, were a place of relaxation. Toilets were more common than you'd think. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of toilets in several pre-modern societies, including the Norse, despite our tendency to believe that toilets are a contemporary innovation. Unlike modern people, the Vikings did not have toilets in their dwellings. However, like with bathhouses and saunas, the restrooms were shared. These communal latrine outhouses were likely less repulsive than they seemed, since the excrement was removed from dwelling quarters by ditches underground. They sometimes dyed their hair. When most of us think of Scandinavians or Vikings, we picture tall blondes with blue eyes. Although Scandinavians today may trace some of their lineage back to the Vikings, they weren't all blonde in the past. Blonde was the ideal, although Vikings were more varied in appearance than most people know. Thus, lye was sometimes used by Vikings with darker hair and beards to bleach their hair blonde. A contemporary hairdresser would advise doing something other than this. Nonetheless, it was a practice that aided in enhancing cleanliness and delaying lice infestations in communities since it also assisted in killing lice. Combs were a staple accessory. Even though we've previously covered how important Vikings were to their hair and beards, you may still be surprised by this fact. The Vikings were also concerned that they always took their combs with them. Typically made of animal bones, these combs were used to remove dirt, insects, and filth from hair and beards many times a day. Few men carried combs in their wallets, Viking style. Even though we may believe that beauty lies within us, we take considerable measures to maintain our looks nowadays. They reportedly shared wash basins. Even the Vikings took baths more often than most people in the Middle Ages, which does not imply that the quality of such baths was comparable to what is considered acceptable now. The same water would be used again at community bathhouses. Even if we find this repulsive, it's crucial to remember that science didn't exist yet. Simply put, people needed to know how unclean polluted water was. It was typical to bathe in a tub of recycled bath water or pass the same water bowl around a big group of guys to wash their filthy faces and beards. They got buried with their grooming tools. This information demonstrates the Vikings' seeming obsession with cleanliness and beauty. Vikings were often buried with weapons and other personal belongings as expected. However, some of these particular objects were grooming implements. Combs, razors, ear picks, and tweezers have all been discovered at ancient Viking gravesites. They were valuable prestige objects, as shown by the fact that many of them were exquisitely ornamented. According to historians, they were often carried in jewelry cases or worn around the neck. The Vikings filed grooves into their teeth. Researchers and historians still need to understand this fully. However, as this image illustrates, archaeologists have often found teeth that have been purposely filed down while examining bones at Viking burial sites. It was carried out by a qualified expert, which further demonstrates how often it was done. There are a few main reasons why this was carried out. One is that the Vikings used it to make themselves seem more influential to their adversaries. According to the other, the grooves signify triumphs. A Viking fighter was thus more effective if they had more teeth with grooves. Causing someone to get dirty was seen as offensive. In addition to believing that cleanliness was essential, Vikings thought it was disrespectful to make a fellow Viking unclean. This includes throwing someone into a pool of water, tearing their clothing, chopping off their hair, and getting dirt on them. Outlawry was the punishment for such behavior against anyone except foes. According to the ancient Icelandic law book Gragas, anyone who willfully disgraced someone by getting them filthy should always get the worse punishment. The length of your beard was an indicator of maturity. Historians think that the Vikings valued wearing a long, well-maintained beard since it was associated with maturity and masculinity. Vikings considered men with a full, thick beard to be more manly and mature. Vikings who could not grow a beard were criticized and made fun of in several medieval texts. Their social standing among their peers was undoubtedly impacted by this as well. The fact that each town had a highly competent and esteemed comb maker indicates that having a good beard was significant in the social order. Magic was believed to heal injuries. The Vikings were no different when it came to superstitions. Vikings believed in magic, at least because it was perceived and used during the Norse Age. Vikings thought sacrifices and magic helped hasten the healing process when wounded in combat. You'll often find references to requesting the elves' assistance healing a buddy while reading written narratives from this era. In the hopes that the elves would accept the gift and assist, this might be accomplished by offering a bull or other valuable animal as a sacrifice and putting it on the hill where they were said to reside. Lack of facial hair meant a lack of competence. As previously discussed throughout the Viking Age, it was considered a sign of immaturity and a lack of masculinity for males to have no facial hair. However, things worsen. It was also thought that those without a striking beard were less capable. Due to their lack of beards, these impoverished guys experienced some very severe prejudice, which indeed hurt their chances of finding marriage and employment. Women, too, wore their hair long. According to literary evidence, the ideal of beauty for Viking women's hair was comparable to that of facial hair for men. The more, the better. Women tended to take good care of their long hair. However, this was different. The law demanded it. This is also shown by the medieval legal treatise Gragas. It makes it evident that women were prohibited from having short hair. Wives, mothers, and the female Viking warriors known as Valkyries were all prohibited. Did they have tattoos? Historians and archaeologists continue to disagree on this point. However, there is evidence that at least some Vikings had tattoos. When writing about their experiences with Vikings, medieval business people from all over the globe describe witnessing dark green lines and patterns covering their skin. Naturally, we cannot be sure that they were permanent tattoos. They might have alternatively been applied as part of a ceremony to frighten others. Hot and cold water amenities existed. Yes, just like us, the Vikings were sufficiently advanced and enjoyed taking enough baths to figure out how to have hot and cold water taps. At least we're sure of this with the Vikings of Iceland. With two different tectonic plates and abundant geothermal activity that warms subterranean water, Iceland is home to many natural hot springs. There is archaeological evidence of outdoor baths similar to those shown, where users could customize the bathing water's temperature using water pipelines flowing from separate hot and cold springs. Hair washing and cutting were women's jobs. Although social expectations for men and women are always changing, several aspects of Scandinavian civilizations have unquestionably evolved since the Norse Age. Among them is the historical practice of women washing and cutting men's hair. It needs to be clarified why, precisely, whether it was a hairdressing service or something women just performed for their husbands. We do know, however, that it was a huge honor. In several works of literature, ladies make lifelong vows to trim and wash a particular man's hair. Meat protein helped them grow tall. In terms of food, Vikings fared better than many people in the Middle Ages. To begin with, they, even the poorer Vikings, consumed meat daily. Many think the Vikings' much higher stature resulted from their diet's high protein content. Although they were not as tall as Scandinavians now, they were unquestionably taller than the typical person in the globe at the time. They consumed meats, including goats, elk, reindeer, and horses. Vikings also ate fruits and vegetables, contributing to their grand stature and good health. Women had quite a lot of power. It's reasonable to argue that women in medieval times did not have as many rights as in contemporary cultures. However, Viking women fared far better than most others. According to research, they also visited other nations, played a crucial role in establishing new towns, and interacted with different populations, such as diplomats. They also possessed several essential rights, including the ability to own property and to file for divorce, and get their dowries back if they proceeded with it. Women also had a voice and may veto a guy they didn't want to marry, even though weddings were planned. Living with the livestock and pets. Large, robust, windowless longhouses, like the one seen here, were the homes of the Vikings. These were constructed with straw roofs and wood, and the buildings were cooked and warmed by a massive fire in the center. In these longhouses, whole extended families would reside in a single, large, rectangular room with little privacy. and the absence of windows meant that the air was likely foul-smelling and heavy with smoke and grime. Additionally, all farm animals and pets would be jammed inside during the chilly winter months. Animals and humans needed this to remain warm, although it was probably not enjoyable. The Anglo-Saxons took advantage of the Vikings' love of bathing. Although maintaining hygiene may have benefited one's health, it wasn't instrumental in combat. Word quickly got out to the Vikings' adversaries that these hardy guys also enjoyed taking baths. The Anglo-Saxons decided to exploit this. They had discovered that the Vikings, who had invaded England, often took lengthy baths. Thus, they would hold off on attacking until they were completely soaked. They were essentially helpless since they were unarmed and nude. Those horned helmets were not a thing. A Viking is only seen in a picture or film with their enormous horned helmets. However, historians agree that it's very improbable that actual Vikings wore them. In close battle, they would have been a disadvantage and impracticable for those warfaring individuals. So where did they originate from? Carl Emil Doppler, a 19th century costume designer, is probably to blame. He created costumes for operas with a Norse theme. Perhaps influenced by the horned helmets used by Germanic priests during rituals, he invented these, and for some reason they became famous. They sold unicorn horns. The idea that Vikings are vicious, bloodthirsty pirates is a little overblown. They were merchants and astute business people, first and foremost, even though they engaged in a reasonable amount of pillaging. They purchased silk and spices from the Middle East, traversed the globe, and sold exotic items like unicorn horns. Yes, exactly. Intentionally, Vikings stole narwhal tusks and passed them off as unicorn horns. There were plenty of wealthy, eager purchasers to deceive since unicorns were thought to be genuine, magical animals. Some became elite bodyguards. Because of their global reputation as ferocious and accomplished warriors, the Vikings had some exciting chances. As a result, several of them served as bodyguards for high-ranking individuals, including national leaders. The Varangian Guard is the most famous example of this. For many hundreds of years, until the 14th century, Byzantine emperors were protected by this exclusive group of valiant and talented Vikings. We'd love to read one of these bodyguards' diaries. What a thrilling destiny! They probably settled in America before Columbus. Exploration, invention, and cultural diversity characterized the Viking Age, which approximately spanned the late 8th to early 11th century and influenced European and global history. As previously discussed, Vikings used their ships to go close and far, plundering and trading their way across the globe. Thus, they most likely arrived in North America centuries before Christopher Columbus, which is corroborated by evidence. One such site is L'Anse aux Meadows in Canada, and since 2010, other Viking villages have been found using satellite images. One particularly significant was uncovered in Newfoundland, where excavations revealed turf walls and an iron hearth, two clear signs of Viking habitation. Vikings ate with spoons and knives. Another example of how Vikings were not as primitive as many think or as shown in films is that they ate with knives and spoons. Forks didn't appear to exist yet. Knives were made of metal, although dining bowls and utensils were often wood-made. They had several functions and were employed for hunting, fighting, and eating all at once. Like the grooming tools, knives and spoons were worn on belts, on a chain around the neck, or kept close at hand. They loved to party. One thing that TV dramas and films appear to be getting right about Vikings is that they were a boisterous group of people who liked to party. Large gatherings of food and drink, and sometimes decadent behavior, characterized Norse feasts. However, celebrations were significant for reasons other than savoring food, booze, and ladies. They were excellent venues for political advocacy, social position reinforcement, networking, and bonding. Runes was just the way to write. Runes are fascinating to archaeologists and history buffs today, as their discoveries provided us with valuable insights and hints about medieval society. The irony is that these items, priceless examples of Viking culture and historical art, are as commonplace to them as our shopping lists. The runic alphabet, known as Futhark, was only the writing system used by literate men and women, albeit not all. It was nothing out of the ordinary. Animal sacrifices were part of life. Using animal sacrifices to get what you want is a recurrent motif in ancient societies, and Vikings were no exception. They would do this to become stronger or healthier, have a better chance of winning wars, or even resolve marital problems. Additionally, Vikings would perform a blood rite before marriage to improve the likelihood of a successful union. It was pretty traditional. A fertility-related animal would be slain, its blood gathered in a basin and then sprinkled over the soon-to-be wedded pair. Skating and skiing everywhere. If you think the winters in Scandinavia are harsh now, imagine how much colder they were in the Norse Age. However, the Vikings soon discovered how to take advantage of the fact that the terrain was covered in snow and ice for most of the year. Since the quickest way to travel in and between towns was to ski and skate on snow and ice, everyone did that. Hundreds of skates made of pine wood and animal bones have been discovered at Viking settlement excavation sites. They ate plenty of fish. The Vikings had abundant food supplies but were disadvantaged since they lived in areas with very severe winters. Fish was a mainstay. The abundance of lakes, rivers, streams, and even the ocean allowed the Vikings to eat various fish, including herring. They liked to prepare fish by salting, drying, and smoking it, much like meat. As a result, it lasted for months and could be used as nourishment while they were at sea. Interesting burial ceremonies. Historians also disagree on this point, so we cannot be sure it's accurate. Nonetheless, some evidence points to distinctive burial customs among the Vikings. According to the tombs containing human bones and personal belongings that have been discovered, they did, in fact, typically bury their deceased. However, other Viking soldiers seem to have had a more spectacular send-off. Along with personal items thought to be necessary for the hereafter, the corpse was placed on a small boat, which was then set on fire. They were no romantics. Although the Vikings believed marriage was necessary, they did not share our modern romantic outlook. First and foremost, marriage was a commercial transaction that increased political and financial riches. As a result, the wedding procedure was lengthy. Both families engaged legal delegates who were medieval attorneys and had to bargain over conditions. It was only a fortunate coincidence that the young couple in question also fell in love. Mead was a staple. It should be no surprise to anybody that Vikings drank a great deal. Drinking was on the plans, whether it was a usual celebration, a wedding, or a get-together. Mead, the forerunner of contemporary beer, was widely available. Honey mead, prepared with natural honey, was the most well-liked. The love of mead is evident even in Norse mythology, since some include a goat that produces mead. Many people think that Viking forebears are responsible for beer's continued dominance as the preferred alcoholic beverage in Scandinavia. Not just fighters, but also storytellers. The Vikings had a gentler side, even though most of their daily existence was harsh and violent. Like everyone else, they enjoyed telling stories, and their tales were full of creativity and symbolism. They also practiced what is now known as spoken word poetry. Vikings would recite lengthy stories over the fire after learning them by heart. Younger generations were taught about Viking history, religion, and culture, and also entertained. The Vikings knew how to make yogurt. Nowadays, whole milk, yogurt, and cheese are everyday breakfast items in the Scandinavian diet, which still heavily relies on dairy products. This goes back to the Vikings, who were adept at exploiting dairy. They raised sheep, goats, and cows, and to prolong the milk's shelf life, they often made cheese, butter, and fermented dairy products. Skyr is a well-liked variety that's still quite popular in Iceland. It's a protein-rich, thick, and sour yogurt cheese spread. They were skilled farmers and hunters. When we think of Vikings, we frequently picture intrepid explorers sailing the oceans or ferocious warriors ravaging far-off places. Even while these audacious deeds have solidified their historical status, they merely scratch the surface of Viking existence. Back home, the creative and industrious communities were the center of their civilization, not conquering. The Vikings were hunters, farmers, and mariners who survived in the harsh climate of Scandinavia. The men, women, and children who stayed on land put forth endless effort to ensure their communities were nourished and ready for the long, brutal winters. Adapted themselves according to the growing seasons. Due to their limited growing seasons, they had to make the most of summer by carefully and creatively raising grains, fruits, and vegetables. When resources were limited, hunting, fishing, and food preservation techniques like smoking, fermenting, or drying were essential for survival. Their capacity to adapt to the demands of the environment is a testament to Viking society's inventiveness and tenacity, which are often overshadowed by stories of exploration and conflict. Everyone had a part to play in the busy farmsteads, from caring for cattle to spinning wool for warm clothes. This way of life supported those at home and the explorers who traveled far and wide. The Vikings are people characterized as much by their pragmatism and sense of community as by their fabled exploits. But we may get a complete image of them by going beyond their travels and raids. All about that multi-grain bread. The Vikings ate bread every day because they enjoyed it. Today's trendy, health-conscious eateries sell their bread for a hefty price. The Vikings used a variety of nutritious grains, including wheat, barley, rye, and oats to make a famous sourdough. They prepared it over an open flame by placing the dough in skillets under the cauldron. The bread was ideal for traveling since it would start mushy and solidify into a crisp loaf.